colleagues and friends. I'm happy, but at the same time a little nervous about today's thing, because it was actually, as Rajarshi just explained, the very unfortunate situation of Professor Harish Wankhede's illness, which brought me here to step into his boots, and that is not quite an easy job. Over and above that, of course, it is not really directly something that I'm working on in terms of the immediately working on. So, with all these caveats, I'd like to make a few remarks by way of both, I think, thinking along with some of the issues which were raised by Rajarshi, and the larger question of how the idea of the public and publics has been generally discussed, and where our recent experiences, to which also there was Rajarshi had just gestured, those also in a way require us to think along these with these concepts, but in a somewhat critical way, taking what is important and relevant for us, but at the same time being aware of the fact that they have a very different provenance. So if one starts with the notion of the public sphere, from where we then step on to the notion of the public, or the other way around. But in fact, I think as was stated a little while ago, that the question of the public in fact comes into our concerns from Habermas's work on the public sphere, which itself has a very different provenance with the rise of various kinds of the literary media, the existence of the salons and so on in 17th, 18th century, 17th, 18th century Europe, but which is very different in a way from the notions of the public as in the public-private distinction, which is where Arendt draws directly from the legacy of classical Greece or Greek thought, and where again the idea of the polis has been quite central. So the question of the polis is, in a sense, in fact, in the heart of both these concepts, despite their different provenance, is a question of speech and exchange. It's a question of of deliberation. So, whether it is the classical concept of the polis, or whether it is the concept of the public sphere, the modern public sphere as in Habermas, the essential thing there has to do with conversation and deliberation. The difficulty, one of the difficulties or the major difficulties with the Habermasian idea of the public sphere, of course it has been repeatedly pointed out, was that it was too restrictive precisely because of its universalist normative claims. The concept has often been critiqued for not allowing us to understand the ways in which multiple publics get constituted and operate in different contexts. Early critiques such as those of Nancy Fraser and some others raise these questions quite powerfully. The idea of multiple public spheres certainly helped in posing some significant questions with respect to the normative dimensions of the concept of the public sphere, to which we know Habermas's own response was to then posit the public sphere as a sphere of spheres. So you have different, so you have, for instance, a Dalit public sphere or a Muslim public sphere or whatever, different kinds of, and it need not be only identitarian, but there are different ways in which these figurations may take place, and yet there would be, according to Habermas, a super sphere where, which would be a sphere of spheres, where you would actually be able to talk across and with each other across different kinds of publics. And there was some value to the idea that there were ways in which debates among the citizenry in public led not only to the formation of public opinion, they also worked in some fashion to keep the possible excesses of the state or government in check. In some contexts, the idea of the public sphere also found some use in a more descriptive sense in identifying formations of specific public discourses, such as, for instance, in our context, Francesco Orsini's work on the Hindi public sphere and its emergence in the wake of a vibrant print culture in the early 20th century. And gradually, however, the idea of a sphere turned out to be quite problematic and was replaced by the more general descriptor, simply public, and indeed multiple publics. Thus, we have the idea of the formation of a Dalit public in northern India in Badri Narayan's recent work, which also refers to the same kind of printed materials like popular pamphlets and booklets that Orsini's work does, but also includes in its idea of public formation the role of, say, BSP rallies or the marking of public spaces in Lucknow during Mayawati's tenure, with the installation of statues of Dalit heroes and heroines. This idea of the formation of a public is certainly far more expansive and takes us away from the way beyond what the Habermasian notion allows for, which is predicated primarily on exchange and deliberation. In some more contemporary media scholarship, the idea of the public has been understood in relation to the emergence of specific media forms, and talks, for instance, of specific publics as they arose in the context of these forms: print public, cinematic public, television public, and now perhaps even a digital public of netizens. This way of understanding the idea of a preferred public referred to the specific modes of address, the sites in which such media like newspapers or citizens or cinema were consumed, as also some of the institutionalized ways in which this happened. It is worth thinking a bit more on this relationship between media and publics, except in the face of small face-to-face communities, and here I think the difficulty with both the polis model, which assumed that you actually assemble in the public square and deliberate. So those were the imaginations of these small groups of free, that is the non-slaves and the non-women and so on. So actually a very small section of the population will be gathered in the public square and deliberate about public matters. Or the 17th, 18th century salons, where the artists or literateurs presented their work for each other. So all these are actually face-to-face situations, and these are not, in that sense, related to or mediated by media, what we understand as media. And that is perhaps why even Lenin too considered the newspaper to be a central organizer of and if you look at actually the way in which political movements also think in terms of constituting their publics, in a certain sense, these media forms, whether it's a newspaper in an earlier time or other modes today, become crucial. At the very least, we can say that print or cinema or the internet are conditions of possibility of the emergence of a myriad of new political subjectivities. Throughout the Indian anti-colonial struggle,
can you hear us? We need to turn the volume.
it was actually down.
It was turned down. It was better before.
Throughout the Indian anti-colonial struggle, we see the emergence of not just a nationalist imagination, not just of a nationalist imagination facilitated by the availability of print technologies, but also of a myriad of other communitarian imaginations, all with their contending claims, either over the nation to be or in opposition to it. Politics in most of our models of understanding it remains a rational activity, and despite Habermas's claim in the structural transformation of the public sphere that actually, despite Habermas's claim that the emergence of mass media and the political party form lead to a situation where communication is no longer rational critical, or no longer a rational critical exercise, as elements of mass propaganda become manifest with the rise of these two entities. Habermas sees the emergence of these institutions as factors that distort the ideal speech situation, where instead of reasoned deliberations, passions and interest take center stage. Nonetheless, the quest for a communicative rationality continues. On the assumption that at some level it should be possible for people to see reason in rational argument. Even if we do not assume the prior existence of rationalist common ground that can make deliberations in the public sphere meaningful, we nonetheless depend on the possibility of something like a consensus emerging from communication, at least at the end of the day, if not as a starting point. So there is a rational consensus at the end of the process. One of the ways in which social and political theory has attempted to deal with the impasse presented by the idea of dialogue and communication is to make a distinction between the public on the one hand and the crowd or mob on the other. From very early on, 19th century thinkers like Dhabi underlined the idea that the public has to be seen as one that is distinguished from a crowd, not only with reference to the fact that the former is dispersed and the latter assembled in one place, but also with reference to the fact that precisely because of this dispersal, the public's very existence is mediated by communication and conversation. And this also means that as opposed to the unitary character of a crowd, the public is always internally differentiated, marked by differences of opinions. Todd also believed that the crowd was always monolithic, since it could only be one could only be part of one crowd at one time, whereas the public was an open entity and one could simultaneously be part of many publics. In the context of the Dreyfus affair, he also contrasted the crowd from the public in another way. While the crowd acquires its shape and form through assembly and suggestion, the public only comes into being through simultaneously reading the news and discussing it. While Todd thus explicitly linked the emergence of the public to the print media, especially the newspaper, he also underlined that for the public to emerge, it wasn't enough for people to simply read the news, but also discuss and form opinions. In many senses, he therefore anticipated not only Habermas, but much of the contemporary usages of the term. Others, like mid-20th century American sociologist Robert Park, have distinguished between the crowd and the public further, in that the former is oriented to action and emotion, whereas the latter, the public, is oriented to deliberation and reason. And this is a distinction that has more or less been retained even in our contemporary discussions of the public, as distinct from oriented towards action, I prefer to limit its use to refer to largely dispersed entities that are centrally linked to specific media forms and practices associated with these forms. In a sense, the public can be identified by its immediate distance from the scene of action. What is crucial in the case of political publics is that their very existence is related to some media form or the other and has to do crucially with conversation and opinion formation. And this might of course sound horribly naive and everlasting. But I am not suggesting that conversations and deliberations are always benign or rational or both. Especially in these days of internet trolling and robotized communication, often of an extremely malign and malignant form, the idea that conversations are benign sounds quite simple-minded. In the best of contexts, conversations are never free or take place among free and equal individuals who are involved in an ideal speech situation. In this sense, this distinction can only be, like all other distinctions, largely suggested and broad. For at some level, even aside from the general inequities of power between individuals involved in conversations, there are other reasons why conversations, even say on social media, can never be rational and equal. In a sense, even though the idea of a rational, self-willing and autonomy-seeking subject has been thoroughly problematized, not the least through the entire early and mid-20th century experience of fascism, and the assumption that people comprising of individual citizens are reasonable or can always be won over by reason because they want to be free and not autonomous, continues to have unabated sway over our theoretical imaginations. Despite the fact that psychoanalysis has repeatedly underlined that this may not be the case and that people do not always desire freedom, that in fact they may fear freedom, as Eric Fromm famously argued in the 40s of the previous century, our assumptions about politics continue to hold on to the fiction of reason and the rational subject. But no less important here is the way in which opinions are and can be simulated through large-scale trolling and robotized interventions that would make a small and aggressive minority appear like a majority. And opinions are swayed by such matters as majority and minority. I should also immediately clarify that I am not for a moment suggesting that all opinion formation that materializes through the media can be seen to form publics. I have argued elsewhere that in recent years, have seen the metamorphosis of the big media into a full-fledged propaganda machine. Big media right from the late 1990s, and here I'll take a little time to actually narrate what I think has been a big change. From the 1990s and through the 2000s had been imbricated in the neoliberal project and participated wholesale in the dumbing down of public discourse in a very peculiar way that has not happened even in the birthplaces of neoliberalism like the US. One has to only go through newspapers and media archives of that period to be able to see that it was party time, and the entire thrust of the media was to basically consume and enjoy. And questions of poverty or caste oppression or anything which sounded negative was considered jarring and not worthy of media space, either in the print media or in the television media. And this situation actually continued. In fact, if you look at the newspapers of that period, the lifestyle issues and consumption matters actually took over the media space so thoroughly and entirely that you had actually even earlier discussions on development, on literature, on the arts and so on. Well, arts in a different sense hit the scene late that is the time of the development of a big art market in India, which was not there earlier. And so, in a sense, everything else, so discussions on books or cinema and so on, all these which used to be quite staple in all weekend newspapers completely disappeared for a long while. And what you had, in fact, was a very, its replacement by a certain kind of art market oriented reporting and coverage on the arts. But and the television, in fact, at this stage, so this is the first phase during which actually what I have often felt, and I have referred to it as the destruction of politics in the political domain, is that this is the period when you actually see politics vacate not just the streets, but in fact political discourse also becomes completely, across the spectrum from the left to the right, you have a huge consensus on a whole range of issues. There are some shadow battles that are fought inside parliaments and so on, but by and large, this is a period of what I have otherwise referred to as the implosion of the political, where the political in fact becomes evacuated of or emptied out of politics. And practically every party begins to share even in the larger neoliberal economic agenda. So what happens then is that the television studio comes to replace political debate. And you have these simulated political debates being enacted on television in the big fight model, where there is actually no space in between very polarized opinions, which are largely set in terms of certain well-known pre-existing polarities, most of which have turned out to be extremely counterproductive. So this, I suppose, takes us back to the Habermasian question of how the rise of a mass media, in fact, is no longer conducive to any kind of rational critical discourse. Here, of course, the question of politics and political then becomes quite central. And in a manner of speaking, it is only around 2006-2007 that the first ruptures start appearing. And I don't have that's not the subject of my discussion today, so I won't go into the details, but it is around then that actually certain kinds of transformations start taking place within the media. Certain kinds of concerns reappear. Questions of poverty, land struggles, and so on and so forth, which have been completely excised, also start gradually reappearing in some form or the other, not in the television media, but at least within in the print media. But in the last few years, there has been a transformation of this big media in a very radical in the negative sense, right? In a very fundamental way, which is basically, again, whatever I have described in terms of the situation of the big media of the 1990s and up to the mid-2000s, this period actually has seen the rise of a propaganda machine. So if the earlier phase was bad enough, what has happened in the last few years is something very different. And most of you, of course, in JNU have witnessed to some form of this. We now have anchors actually playing the role of lynch mob instigators, deliberately misreporting, sensationalizing and exhorting their public into mob or vigilante action. However, I think it might still be useful to maintain the distinction between a public and a mob that may get formed out of it. The very moment which a lynch mob forms, it ceases to be a public. The point, so it is true that there is a television viewing public and certain kinds of ways in which some kinds of opinion formation also takes place. But that is still a different thing from its metamorphosis into a mob. The point I am making here, of course, is that whichever way we look at it, politics today is utterly and thoroughly mediated and mediatized. The media is not just the environment in which politics happens. It is what frames politics in a way that we have not seriously addressed yet as political science. One can look at another instance of, and this is a very different kind of instance from the way in which television, for example, or television anchors would exhort a mob or a lynch mob. So you have a certain kind of formation emerging. But this, if I take the instance of a big rally which took place in Calcutta following the Sindoor, after Sindoor, where a huge rally which probably became one of the big markers of change or momentous in terms of the shift that marked the position of the intelligentsia vis-a-vis the government, was this rally called the Dhikkar Michil, which was again, which took place in Kolkata, organized by people, intellectuals, students and cultural activists in a loose network over the social media. Many of the participants in the rally had, till the other day, been supporters of the ruling left front, as had been the present in revolt in both Sindoor and Bandyopadhyay. And they were all, in classical Tardian terms, in conversation and had formed, they, I mean the intellectuals or the cultural activists and so on, and formed a strong opinion about the present struggle and the violence existed upon them. The deliberations were conducted once again at a distance from the actual scene of struggle and action. And yet, this is a question that I am sort of posing for myself and for all of us to think about. This is not, so this is a kind of ephemeral appearance of a public in a protest demonstration organized once again through social media conversations, and yet it doesn't really take the form of what we understand as a crowd or a mob. So in that sense, I think we have a whole range of experiences in our current contemporary history. One of the other important moments, I think, on which there was very sharp difference of opinion and disagreement among many of us, was the early days of the anti-corruption movement, where again there was convergence of huge masses of people on the streets, but which did not take the form of, and these are, I am making a distinction here, of course, between rallies of mobilized by political parties, which are actually more cohesive in certain sense, and there is a certain degree of leadership there which, so a certain degree of discipline and so on is enabled there. I am not including those. I am talking more of these spontaneous formations where people collect in large numbers, assemble in large numbers over a period of time. So the anti-corruption movement, in fact, when the Ramlila Maidan thing was going on, was over a fairly long period of time. And yet it does not degenerate, it remains in fact at a level which, despite the fact that it is assembled, is closer to the idea of a public in the sense in which I earlier tried to make the distinction, rather than in the form of a mob or a crowd. But to conclude, I want to actually now just refer to some other issues which I have been seized with for some time, in terms of how we deal with these categories. So I'll just take two questions here. One, since Rajarshi brought up the issue of the Arendtian frame, and I myself, I must confess, have been greatly enamored of and fascinated by Hannah Arendt's position for a very long time, where to be able to act in public was to be free. So freedom resided in the public domain. And you could, the domain of the social, this is in fact Arendt's almost direct relation to the classical Greek Aristotelian position. So the domain of the social was always the domain of oppression and unfreedom. That was so. Labor and work in the social domain is slavery. It is only action which identifies with freedom. And to be able to act in concert is what produces power, it is what produces freedom, which are both in Arendt's terms practically coterminous. You become free by becoming powerful through acting in concert. And so in a certain sense there is this heroic notion of citizenship here which requires permanent action. Increasingly I have felt, this is something which, since I referred to Eric Fromm and the whole problem with the understanding of the self-heading autonomous subject in the beginning, that this is something I've always found difficult to understand. And so this is one of the questions which I'm trying to grapple with, which I certainly want to place before you. If it is true that people do not always only desire freedom and autonomy, if it is true that many people, most of us in all our contexts, whether you are living in housing societies or you are living in the university and so on, would much rather pass on the burden of taking day-to-day decisions onto somebody else and relax. And basically, transferring of that agential, or what Edward Said once said, transferring of that agential authority onto some figure of power, or some figure of authority. In a way, it could be the, as Said in his discussion takes on from Lukács or others, that it could be in some case a figure of a fascist leader. It could be the figure of the party in the Marxist frame. But in either case, or in many of these cases, what you have is a delegation of that agential authority, or agential power onto some figure of authority. So that you don't always want to be free, because to be free actually involves too much. It involves continuous permanent action. It requires continuous permanent involvement. It requires taking decisions and taking responsibility. And that is not how politics functions. Unfortunately, all our political theorization depends on the idea of the general will in some fashion, or the popular will, which is its more empirical form, where we assume that, and the basic assumption is the same, that everybody wants to be politically active and everybody wants to participate in decision making. Whereas, if we look at election figures across the world, you can safely say that on an average 50% of the people at least don't vote. They don't even turn up to vote. So, even those who are turning up to vote are only turning up to simply pass on delegate their authority to somebody else, to elect a leader which will free them of responsibility for the next 5 years. But what about those 50% or so who don't even appear to do that? So that now the government has been contemplating making voting, forcing people to vote, right? Making voting compulsory. What does this tell us about our fundamental assumptions about politics? Does this actually this whole myth or fiction of the dramaturgy of the will, from which you have notions of power, representation, and so on and so forth, all these actually are fundamentally flawed in my opinion. And if we have to move out of that, how can we think of politics differently? This is where the question of publics in the way we are discussing it actually becomes important, because these publics are not permanent formations. These publics are not formations which organize themselves into parties and act and transform and so on. These publics have more limited, restricted lives. They may arise around specific issues. They may arise around certain kinds of imperatives. They may arise around certain kinds of immediate identity concerns, which are not always questions of pure identity, because they are questions of power there. So, for example, the whole Dalit upsurge in the recent past, post-UNA, is another form in which we can see how at a particular moment certain kinds of things which can lead to mass mobilizations. But mass mobilizations are not permanent. So in fact the classic Arendtian problem was precisely that. Beyond the fleeting moment of action, how does power actually sustain itself on an individual basis? If it is true that power emerges from collectivities in action, then it is easy to understand that in that moment of, in that passing ephemeral moment when people come together to collect in the public square. But beyond that moment, how does power actually endure? And that, I think, is a question to which Arendt certainly had no answer except the answer which is the Republican answer, which is to be permanently active, permanently be the interrogators of power and so on. So this has been a concern of mine, which basically means that we need to think politics beyond the paradigm or framework of the will. Pierre Rosanella calls it the dramaturgy, something like that. He calls it the theology of the will or something like that. So that's one. The second concern that I have, and I'll close with this, is that we have, in our own experience, I mentioned this earlier once, something which I've been trying to work on, that the ways in which crowds and mobs and so on have become part of our everyday lives in the recent past, but particularly through the latter half of the 20th century, maybe even before that, was not somehow the form in which actually the popular was encountered by the intelligentsia in India. So we actually never really had, till very recently, terms in Indian languages which were negative in terms of, see, greed is the maximum you will get in Hindi. I can think of a couple of other Indian languages where you can find words which are actually not charged negatively in the way in which crowd theorists or psychoanalysis and so on have done it in the context of Europe, because that represented a particular kind of phenomenon of the fear of masses and the fear of the crowd in the wake of the collapse of the class system and the loss of power of the aristocracy. And that, our context was more in fact of an disempowered elite returning obsessively to the popular because of the context of colonialism and the fact that the elite and the popular were both in some fashion had to be allies in the struggle against colonialism. So in fact, the entire relationship of the colonial or colonized intelligentsia to the popular was quite different. And that in continues to work at some level. So even though these are new experiences which we need to theorize afresh, I think it's always helpful to keep the backstory also in mind, which is where we come to the question of different provenances. Thank you.